long, but my first congregation that I served was Bethel CRC in Acton, and it was during my time there. I was part of this region, part of this classis, and had the opportunity to preach here a couple times, and it's just really good to be back. I want to share with you just a little bit about my role, and I'm going to ask you to just go to the next slide. We've been talking about ministry shares this morning, and the first thing that I want to be able to do is just say thank you, Maranatha, for your faithful giving to ministry shares, because not only does it bless ministries like Disability Concerns, but it blesses Calvin Theological Seminary, where I now serve. And we're just grateful for your faithful giving, ministry shares or offerings directly to Calvin, and especially your prayers. You are partnering with us as we together at the seminary, and you here and around the Christian Reformed Church, partnering together to equip men and women for ministry. And we anticipate God calling people into ministry to serve the church and to equip us as those who lead and those who minister and serve. And the seminary is one of the ways that we do that equipping and that we call people into that level of service. And so I just want to share with you a few things about what's happening at Calvin. Between 250 and 300 students. And as you join with us, you are literally sending these men and women out across the globe. We just celebrated commencement, graduation this past Friday, like not 2 days ago, but I guess 9 days ago, just over a week ago. And there were 53 graduates being sent out into 13 countries. And so certainly here in North America, we benefit greatly from some of those ministry leaders in Canada and the United States, in the Christian Reformed Church and other denominations. But beyond that as well, we're serving countries around the world. One of those, there's about, although 13 people graduated, 13 different countries were represented in the graduating class. There's even more countries represented in the student body, over 20. And of course, one of those is Canada, about 31 Canadians right now who are being equipped to serve, largely to come back to Canada and to serve the church and to serve the kingdom here. And so we're just thrilled to be part of that journey with them and with you as you partner with us. Let me tell you just a little bit about my role. The name is Canadian Church Relations Liaison. It's this awkward title. You can bring us to you have brought us to the next slide. But it really captures well what it is I do, because my role really is to connect the seminary with churches, pastors, ministry leaders, and ministries throughout Canada to serve in that sort of liaison role. So I live and serve in Canada, living just outside of Peterborough. Last congregation I served was in Peterborough. But now across Ontario and across Canada, meeting with pastors and other ministry leaders to just talk about what it is the seminary needs to be doing in order to better be equipping ministry leaders for Canada here in the Canadian context. What partnerships can we be building? We have been partnering with congregations sometimes and with other ministry agencies in order to join forces to say, how can we strengthen you here at Maranatha? How can we strengthen the church in general into the calling that God has given us as His people, the mission that He has placed us on? The biggest part of the role that I'm enjoying, that I love, is just meeting with men and women who are preparing for ministry, hearing their stories. Every one of those stories is unique. You know, that disability concerns video we watch, no asterisk. Everyone matters. Everyone has this sense of calling. Everyone comes with a unique story. And to hear the ways that God has been working that story out in people's lives has been wonderful. And then helping them see how Seminary and some of the resources that we have might be helpful to them as they prepare for that journey. And in fact, that's really the issue that we're going to wrestle with this morning as we turn to God's Word and turning to Exodus 3. I'm going to invite you to turn there with me. We're really turning to that issue of calling. These men and women that I've been meeting with have these wonderful stories, but God has a wonderful story in each and every one of our lives and is calling each and every one of us to service in His kingdom in one fashion or another, depending on who we are. And so Exodus 3, beginning at verse 1, we're going to hear these perhaps familiar words with regards to Moses and the way that God visited him and spoke with him and to him. But our prayer this morning is that God is going to speak those words into our lives in a fresh way, that we're going to hear them anew, that His Spirit, who ministers to each one of us personally, is going to be speaking as we listen, and as we set aside whatever worries and concerns that we've brought into this time, and as we just seek to hear Him and to hear Him speak. Exodus chapter 3, begin at verse 1. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush doesn't burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and with honey, the home of the Amorites, Perizzites, Hittites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. Go, Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Thanks be to God. You know, to be honest, I'm not sure how I missed it. I mean, I've read this passage countless times, and I'm guessing that if you've been a follower of Jesus for some time, you've heard this story before too. But somehow, over the years, I had missed it every time. I had always kind of just assumed, I guess, that Moses had heard God's voice calling to him from within the burning bush, Moses, Moses. And that's why he had stopped to investigate. But several months ago, I was reading Ruth Haley Barton's book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, and she helped me see something for the first time. It was this light bulb that went on. Moses didn't stop because he had heard God calling, as I had always assumed. No, he first noticed and stopped, and then with his curiosity kind of piqued, he turned to look at this unusual sight, and it was only then that God spoke, that God called him. It's so clear in the passage. Moses didn't speak until Moses stopped. It wasn't the other way around, that Moses stopped because he heard God speak. God didn't speak until Moses noticed something different. God didn't speak until Moses turned aside. And actually, once I saw it and stopped to think about it, I realized, but isn't that often the truth? Isn't that often how God speaks? It's when you and I take time to listen. If you and I want to hear from God, we're going to first have to give God our attention. Of course, that takes intentionality on my part, doesn't it? Especially in an age where a glut of information is coming at us 24/7 through this little device that I keep in my pocket. But the reality is that when I pause, when I turn it all off, when I choose to stop, and when I choose to focus my attention on this God who is at work all around me, then I will see signs of his activity. I will, and you will as well. We will hear him speak. But it's not just when God spoke that I find interesting in this passage. It's also what he chose to speak about. Once he had his attention, the very first thing that God chose to talk to Moses about was this issue of Moses' calling. And in fact, that's where I'm inviting us to focus our attention this morning, this issue of God's calling in our lives. The God we serve is a God who invites us to follow. And so he's necessarily a calling God, an inviting God. He invites us to follow. He's formed us and he's shaped us to serve his purposes for his glory. And so he calls. He calls us to enter into his work. He invites us to join him in the work that he's doing. Co-laborers was the way we heard it expressed in the video. Stage 5, co-laborers. For Moses, the calling that God had for him on this particular day was huge. Go, Moses, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. I've heard my people cry. I've heard their suffering, and I've chosen you, Moses, to be my instrument of salvation. Through you, I'm going to rescue my people. Through you, I'm going to save those who belong to me. I'm going to bring them out of slavery into the land that I've promised them. That must have been daunting. A supersized calling. But what I want us to recognize this morning is that calling to Moses didn't kind of come out of the blue. And in fact, God's not likely going to call you to some task out of the blue either. That's often our fear, isn't it? We think if I really surrender to God and to His purposes, He's going to call me to do something that I really don't want to do. Or He's going to call me to go somewhere that I really don't want to go. There's this sort of fear that we have of really turning our lives over to God and to His purposes. You see, that's not typically, though, the way God works, calling us to random things out of the blue. No, God's calling arises out of our story. And in fact, if you take absolutely nothing else home today, you are home. If you take nothing else out of today's message, I want you to, at the very least, remember that single truth. God's calling in your life arises out of your story. It arises out of your story. When we finally, pay attention, when we stop, we realize that God has been weaving the tapestry of the story in our lives. And we'll see that the calling He lays on us arises out of that story that He's already been weaving together. I mean, wasn't that true for Moses? Think about it, okay? Who better to send him to Egypt? Moses was born there. This was part of his story. He had lived most of his life there. And who better to confront Pharaoh? He was raised in Pharaoh's courts. It made sense. And of course, he was no Egyptian. He was an Israelite himself. And so the only Israelite who had ever been a person of influence and privilege in Egypt was now being called back to Egypt to negotiate freedom for the people of Israel. His unique journey had destined him for this calling. But it wasn't just his journey. It was also his deep inner convictions, and in particular, his deep inner sense of justice that had prepared him for this. Much earlier in life, you remember the story, much earlier in life, when he had seen one of his own people being mistreated by an Egyptian slave driver, what did he do? In anger, in a fit of rage, he murdered the Egyptian. Well, God was now going to take that deep-seated sense of justice and redirect it. God was going to take those deep inner convictions that He had given Moses. I mean, those things that burn most passionately within us are gifts from God and callings, part of our calling from God. He was going to take those deep inner convictions He had given Moses, and He was going to direct them away from murderous purposes to life-giving purposes. God uses the whole package when He calls. He uses our heritage. He uses our life experiences, our personality, our passions, our genetics, our skills and our gifts, our current life situation, the time and the place where we live. He uses it all. In other words, He uses the complete you and the complete me when He calls us to accomplish those tasks that He calls us to. I love what Parker Palmer says. He says, calling doesn't come from willfulness. In other words, it's not about me choosing or me forcing God's hand. No, it comes from listening. I must listen to my life, he says, and try to understand what it is truly about, my life. Or my life will never represent anything real in the world, no matter how earnest my intentions. Are you following what Parker's saying there? Because I really believe he's on to something. Discerning God's call begins with listening. It begins with listening to your life, because your life is the place where God is speaking. That's where God's at work. He's at work in and through your life. He's speaking in and through the person that He's made you to be and the story, and He's speaking through the story that He's weaving through you. So knowing what He wants, knowing what God wants, begins with knowing who you are. Begins with understanding who He's made you to be and the journey that He's been leading you on from day one. One of the seminary students that I met with was sharing his call into vocational ministry with me. And as we sat there, we're in a restaurant, and he's telling me stuff that happened to him when he was like 4 years old. He's telling me stuff that an elderly congregational member had said to him when he was an early teen or a preteen, 12 or 13 years old. He's telling me stuff about his first couple years at university and how this A student absolutely bombed out and quit, utterly depressed. He was telling me how he ran from all these expectations that he felt from mom and dad, from his home, and he ran literally to the other side of the world only to find God meeting him there. He told me all that and like a dozen other things. And at the end of it all, once all the pieces were kind of laid out on the table, at the end of it all, he could see how it all fit in this one giant puzzle that God had been piecing together throughout his life. When he stopped, when he became curious with the Spirit, and when he stopped to pay attention and turned aside, God spoke. And it was as if everything that had ever happened in his life suddenly came together. God had used it all to call him to a life of ministry, of service. One of the ways that you'll know you've discerned God's call in a particular situation is that suddenly events and circumstances and things that people have said, maybe even from years ago, will suddenly kind of come into alignment. Suddenly make sense. Yes? Have you experienced that? Typically, God's call doesn't come out of left field. Typically, it's sort of as you listen to your life, as you listen to God's activity in your life, and as you listen to your deepest passions and convictions, those passions and convictions He's given you, things suddenly fit, things suddenly make sense, and that moment feels like holy ground. Take off your sandals, Moses, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. But here's the surprising thing, or maybe not all that surprising given who we are, but here's the surprising thing. Moses still resisted. Moses knew he was in the presence of a holy God. He took off his shoes like we were invited to do at the beginning of the service this morning. He knew his life had been leading to all this, but still he resisted. He resisted in all the same ways that you and I typically resist. He had 1,000,001 doubts. He had 1,000,001 questions. Who am I? And who really are you, God? And what if they won't listen to me? What if they won't believe me? And what will I say? And what if I'm not good enough? Moses was already sensing what you and I likely already know deep down inside, but often don't admit. God's calling will always make you feel inadequate. I think that's one of the reasons we push back. God's calling will always take us beyond our comfort zone, maybe to Italy, street evangelism. It will always involve risk and uncertainty. But God's response to Moses, and to Moses' fears, and to Moses' doubts, and Moses' questions, his response is the same response he gives to every one of us in our callings. His response is always a variation on a single theme. Same theme, maybe expressed a little different, but that single theme is, I am with you. It's the promise of God's presence. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses asked in verse 11. And God said in verse 12, I am with you. That was his answer. And that settled it. The people will follow you, Moses, because you have met with me. When you're living out of who you are, who I've created you to be, when you're living out of the story that I've been crafting in your life, then all that matters, Moses, is I am with you. This isn't about security. This isn't about, success and failure. This isn't about your ego. This is about your faithfulness to my call and the promise of my presence to be real in your life. I think Jesus understood Moses' hesitation all too well. I mean, he had known throughout his entire life where his ministry was headed, the cross. How many times didn't he try to make the disciples understand? He knew that was the end goal. But at the end of the day, when push really came to shove in the garden, the night of his arrest, he wondered if there was some other way. Right? He prayed that this cup might pass him by. See, knowing God's will, knowing God's calling, and then doing God's will are often, always, two different things. But in the end, Jesus understood that your salvation and mine was his to do. It was the story that his Father had been weaving through his life from the very beginning. In fact, throughout eternity, he knew his story. And he surrendered to that story, to God's calling in the midst of his story. God is calling you as well. Maybe he's calling you big, to some life-encompassing task that he has for you. Or maybe what he's calling you to right now is just one aspect of that overall calling, one of those good works that he prepared in advance for you to do. But either way, you're not going to You're not going to hear it unless you regularly stop, unless you pause to ask questions of the Spirit, unless you take time to listen. So what is your next yes to God supposed to be? What step is he inviting you to take? What's he inviting you to give up, perhaps? Or what task is he calling you to pick up? What relationship is he inviting you to build up? Whatever it is, I know that you'll never be able to say yes without first reminding yourself of his promise. I am with you. And so I want to encourage you, I want to challenge you to say yes. You will never find deeper joy or fuller meaning or more lasting purpose than in that word, yes. Yes, Lord, speak, for your servant is listening. Pray with me. Father, thank you that you invite us to be co-laborers with you. We pray, oh God, that you would invite us again, even this morning. Call us to a fresh avenue of service. Call us to the place that you would have us be, the place you've been preparing for us, in who you've made us to be, and in the story you've been weaving through our lives. Point the way, God.